Welcome, Nervana.
I thought you would be the perfect person to talk about how this is affecting Islamists and currents of Islamism in the Islamic world.
The average age of assembly of experts is way above the average age of the US Senate, which says something.
Oh, wow.
And keep in mind that these are people who don't speak English. So they wanted to have a Zoom meeting and they just gave up. They're like, how do you teach 80-something-year-old Iranian clerics to go on Zoom to vote? Fuck it, let's meet. And they were bummed during the
Oh my God, is that the story?
Yeah.
The Arab world have short memory. So they react to event more than they think about it in depth. You have to remember that the Islamic Republic is the only Islamist group that managed to succeed in ruling a Muslim country and trying to provide an alternative to Western modernity. That's what they try to sell to the Arab public. So in 1979, there was loads of excitement about the Islamic Republic, and there was calls to forget the difference between Sunnite and Shiite sects and just focus on a success of an Islamist group. However, things have changed after there was the Iraq-Iran war, there was the Gulf states and their hostility toward Iran and Iran hostility toward the Gulf states, events in Lebanon, Syria, which changed the Arab public opinion. Now things have changed, reverted back to Islamopopulism. It is probably the first time when the Western response to the war in Iran is similar to the Islamist or the current Arab world response to Iran. So in the West, you'll find the progressive, the left, the Democrats are skeptical and against the war. And a lot of Islamists based in the Western societies are against the war. In Egypt in particular, there is the same mantra, if the mullah regime fall, then we are next. And funny enough, you will hear that in Turkey. I followed Turkey and I've seen similar response that if Netanyahu win, we are next. The next confrontation between Israel and Turkey. The same in Egypt. The next confrontation will be between Israel and Egypt. Iran made mistakes. However, we have to forget those mistakes now and stand by the Mullah Republic. What is happening to contradict this is that Iran start to fire missiles from day one, missile and ballistic missiles and drones against the Gulf states. So the response in the Gulf is completely different. The Gulf public opinion saying we were attacked, we were not part of the war, we even campaigned against this war. How dare you, i.e. to the Egyptian, the Jordanian, Algerian, how dare you stand by Iran while we being shelled day and night and our national security breached in an audacious way. And that is now creating tension and incredible exchange on social media, on Twitter. There is the ex-head of the Arab League, an Egyptian called Amr Moussa. He was the foreign minister of Egypt during Mubarak time. He was the head of the Arab League for a long time, and he is well known internationally, supposedly a respected guy. And he wrote a whole thread on X saying that we have to stand with the Mullah Republic. And that immediately triggered top Saudi analysts replying to him and saying, you downplay the crimes of Iran, the destruction of countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, etc. Funny enough, the Syrian, who are obviously now backed by the Saudi, and a lot of Saudi financing the current regime in Syria, is standing up against the Egyptian now and saying, how dare you doing this? So it become like a circus on social media. But the thing is, the average Egyptian know very little about Iran. In fact, the diplomatic relations were restored only recently. I've been to Iran. The average Egyptian didn't. There was actually an Egyptian who visited Iran 2 years ago during Ramadan, and he was stunned that none of the Iranians were fasting. The Iranian, most of them are not practicing Muslims. If they are loyal to the regime or not loyal to the regime. It's blasphemy in Cairo, which supposedly a secular country, to eat in daytime Ramadan or have a coffee or go to McDonald's. This is blasphemous in Egypt. He turned up to Tehran and he found everybody smoking, drinking, coffee, tea, having lunch. And he was incredibly shocked. So unfortunately, people don't understand the dynamic in Iran. People don't understand why the Islamic Republic was hated by the Iranian people. The Islamic Republic focused on Shia communities in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Egypt have very small amount of Shiite community. So the average Egyptian didn't see how devious this regime and how ruined countries like Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. My mom told me, Islamists will always be open to others when they are weak. And they will be the first to get rid of others when they are strong. The re-emergence of Islamism in Egypt was after the Six-Day War, when they start to be active again in the society after Nasser cracked down on them. So my mom witnessed how they celebrated the Six-Day War defeat. They saw that as an opportunity to spread their ideology in Egyptian society. How they are trying to convince people that defeat was God's punishment to the society that becomes secular. But also as a single woman, a widow, they obviously try to pick on weak targets, wear the hijab, make the daughter wear the hijab. And she was not the sort of person who bow down or be bullied by them. She raised me on that.
One of the perplexing things about this Islamic Republic is that Tehran has always been very different from the rest of the country. My perception is when the revolution happened, yes, it happened in Tehran, but a lot of the energy for the revolution in Tehran was leftism and student leftism. And this combined with Khomeini and his power base in small cities and in the countryside, extremely conservative areas. So very quickly, Khomeini consolidated power, killed many of the leftist leaders. In a very real sense, Tehran has been under occupation of an invading force since 1979. Tehran thought they were getting something completely different.
You are absolutely right, but I would say 50-50. In universities in Egypt, there were a lot of Iranian students, 76 to 79, and they were all wearing black. My mom clashed with them. They had discussion about Islamism and modernity. They've been kicked out of Egypt after the death of Sadat because the killer of Sadat, the mullah celebrated that guy and named the street in Tehran with his name, Sulaiman al-Halab. They only removed that recently to have diplomatic relationship with Egypt again. There was Islamist students among the revolutionary. Modernity and secularism was always in suburbs of Tehran and cities like Shiraz. I backpacked in Iran the first year of Ahmadinejad. Cities like Shiraz was well known to be not a big fan of the mullahs, cities of Iranian identity, poem, Hafiz, etc. While Mashhad, Tabriz will be more religiously conservative. So yes, there was a big sect of the leftist dominating the revolution in Tehran, but the vast majority of the revolutionary were still Islamist. I would say 40-60, but this is a crude number.
If you go outside these cities, how fanatically religious is Iran? Because I've been hearing some contradictory things.
This is one of my biggest shock from visiting Iran, is that I noticed that people in rural areas are not as religious as Egyptian. Assume you visit a village in South Egypt, near Luxor, Aswan. Most of the women are wearing the hijab, even if they don't support the Muslim Brotherhood, in Orthodox conservatism. If you ask a woman to remove her hijab, even if there are no men around, they will refuse. In Iran, I met people from villages. Obviously, it was baking hot because hijab is mandatory. And because I'm a foreigner, I was careful not to break the law. I was wearing the scarf and the long mantu. So when I walked uphill, I was sweating like hell. The Iranian love picnics. I met families sitting around having their food. And then the lady saying to me, "What are you wearing? Take this off. There is no morality police here. You are free." In Egypt, there is a strong social Islamist base, which may be politicized, not politicized, supporting the regime, support the Muslim Brotherhood, but there is a solid base of conservatism, susceptible to political ideas from Islamism in general. In Iran, it is the opposite. Social Islamism is not that prevalent, while political Islamist is. So you might find people who are not necessarily keen on the hijab, but they support the mullahs politically,
Really?
especially if they have family or background related to the religious clergy in Iran. So you'll find those who not necessarily pro enforcing the hijab, restricting women, but they are loyal to the regime. But in their ordinary life, they are not that religious.
I want to ask Nervana how the Muslim Brotherhood is reacting to all of this.
Muslim Brotherhood are the most pragmatic Islamists ever. They are willing to change color depend on the wave. So for now, the Muslim Brotherhood are 100% supporting the mullah. Qatar-funded television in London are 24/7 pro-mullah because this is populism for them. They thrive on conflict. That's 101 Islamism. Give me a conflict and I will exploit it. Today, Iran is a victim. Tomorrow, Iran is the enemy and vice versa.
In Turkey, I assume people are outraged, but really worried about this whole Kurdish business.
They are. I visited your lovely country. And one of the things I struck by, I like to believe I'm still devout Muslim, but in a different way. But I'm sure you know how there are beautiful mosques around Iran. So visiting Shiite mosque was something interesting for me because I never seen a Shiite mosque in Egypt. I've seen families have picnics in mosque, in Yazd, in Shiraz, in Isfahan. But when the call of prayer happened, they don't go and pray. That shocked me.
Going to be a little bit rude, and I apologize, but most Iranians only go to the mosque when they need to go to the bathroom. It's on the hijab. I have an anecdote. There's a very conservative MP, Ali Motahari, whose father was a prominent revolutionary cleric, Mortaza Motahari. His brother-in-law is Ali Larijani. A few months ago, before the protests began, I kid you not, he literally said, "We've given up enforcing the hijab law. Just ladies, please have the courtesy of not showing your belly buttons in public." So they had completely given up. One more thing, because F1 al-Muslimin came up. Khamenei and Khomeini both were hugely influenced by two clerical figures. The Iranian cleric was named Nawab Safavi, who was executed by the Shah for assassinations he and his followers conducted. And Nawab himself was hugely influenced by Sayyid Qutb and Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Khamenei and Khomeini were two of very few clerics in Iran who were influenced by Qutb directly. Khamenei translated three and was in the middle of translating a fourth book by Qutb before he was exiled by the Shah. All four of the books of Qutb wrote a couple dozen books that he translated are all focused on Israel and Jews.
Yes.
Though it is interesting, Khomeini was much more a clerical figure and much more an Islamist figure than Khamenei. Khamenei never had the religious credentials that Khomeini had. His son too, actually. There are ranks in Shiism. Khamenei was either Hujjatul Islam or Hujjatul Islam wal Muslimin, which is 2 or 3 ranks below a Grand Ayatollah that you need to be a supreme leader. They had to forge his credentials to make him eligible for supreme leadership. Not Khomeini. Khomeini was a Grand Ayatollah. Khamenei was more a politically activist cleric, not a religious leader. So because of that, he's always been more interested in politics of Islam than the scholarship and study of Islam, or was. I keep using present term about Khamenei. May he rot in hell. But you see the intellectual descendancy of Muslim brothers here. And now, as for mosques, I have gone to a mosque once and it was reluctant for a funeral.
What percentage of Iranians are irreligious now? And when did this happen?
There is a survey by Gaman from 2021, so it's dated. In the survey, I think 40% of Iranians identify as Sunni or Shiite Muslim or Sufi.
What percentage of
So-
Iranians are Sunni?
Under 10%. The Sunnis are mostly in Southeast. Even Iranian Arabs and Turkic ethnicities are Shiite. Some 10% say they are Zoroastrian, but Zoroastrians don't take converts. They're just Iranian nationalists who want to identify with some religion that's not Islam, so they say Zoroastrian, but they are really not religious. It's over 50% who are irreligious, and you have 1 or 2% Baha'i and Jewish and Christian, and you have a huge, relatively, when I say huge, a couple of percentage points, but several million underground evangelical converts, underground churches. But over 50% are some sort of religious.
Shay, I had no idea that Qutb had anything to do with Iran. I didn't think he was a Shiite.
No, he wasn't.
So-
But he was influential nonetheless.
They were influenced by Qutb through Nawab and then directly by his own writing, to the extent that they were influenced by Qutb, especially Khomeini, more so even than Khomeini. It was the political aspects, not the religious influence of Qutb. It was mostly enmity to Israel and America and Jews.
I never conceived of such a thing as political Islam with no religious underpinnings. I can't even get my head around what that is.
I think you're overstating it, but it's such a concept. If you go back to a guy called Sayyid Jamaluddin Asadabadi or Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, late 1800s, he's a cleric who is upheld by the Islamic Republic as one of the early political Islamists. This is during the Qajar era, and he ends up being a huge influence on the constitutional revolution in Iran, which creates a parliament and a constitutional democracy for a brief period. So Asadabadi is very interesting. Some of his writings in French and English suggest that he was an atheist, actually. He believed in what Huntington would call a clash of civilization. He wanted an Islamic civilization revival that was not necessarily influenced by religion. You would say that you needed all the religious stuff to build a civilization 1300 years ago, but you don't need it anymore now. He was what we would call a tribal Muslim.
Are there any similar currents in Egyptian Islamist thought?
Political, but not
Religious?
No, this is an interesting difference between
Yeah.
Iran and in
Yeah.
Egypt. Egypt is in more pious society in general, and they are mixing the piety with the politics, and it's very hard to detangle. But I want to add one thing about the relationship with the mullahs. Found his series and very interesting. Sayyid Qutb was actually not a scholar, he was a teacher. And he was sent free scholarship by the government to America in 1948. And he was radicalized in America. He hated the West. And his books was mainly about that we Muslim can destroy Western civilization and build an alternative society that answer all the problems of the West. He was psychotic. His books appealed to many, unfortunately, Muslim men with inferiority complex, I hate to say. But Khomeini and Khamenei were interested in his answer to modernity. What is the weakness of American and Western societies? And the obsession with women is coming from how Sayyid Qutb presented what he perceived as freedom of women in America, but for him was just decadence of American women that he wanted to prevent in the Muslim world.
I don't want to overstate this trend in Iran. Most people within the regime believe in Islam. As Fred Kagan says, you can't walk around, say something without eventually believing it. The bigger tension in Iran, when Islam and politics come at a conflict, who makes the compromise? And you can see a similarity in our own politics in Europe and the United States. There are people who are not pious Christians, but still want Christian politics, right? There is such a trend. And it's similar. In Iran, Khomeini very much believed that when they come at odds, politics make the compromise. The clergy were upheld as the primary source of power. Under Khomeini, it became politics, and it became the security establishment. Arafi, who was very close to Khomeini himself, and who's the third member of the interim council, and the head of the seminaries, has said that he has bemoaned that every time the seminaries want to do something, someone comes and tells us that's someone else's business, meaning the security establishment. So that tension exists. That is not to say that the security establishment is filled with secular people. Though, again, as you see in Shamkhani, wedding video. There are
Yeah.
people like that.
A lot of these ideological projects, to the extent that political Islam is an ideological project, they drift into security apparatus primacy. And if you look at the USSR, which was not, you could call it a religion, I guess, it's a different political philosophy, but you see the same phenomenon is over time, the needs and dynamics of the security state overwhelm the founding principles.
Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, it's a very good book. And the point that she makes is that when the USSR collapsed, the security establishment got together and said, our purpose here was to defeat the free world. And communism was a means to that. It failed. Let's find a new way to do it.
The Americans think that support for the regime is thin. We can just, as Hitler famously said about the Soviet Union, kick the door in and the whole rotten thing will fall down, which is what he said to his generals before Barbarossa. Making the same mistake, even if support for conservative Shiite Islam is thin, that does not mean that this resistance of invasion is thin.
Depends how you define thin. I kept trying to find one person who was against a foreign attack to help the people overthrow the regime, and I could not find that person. If I had to guess, I would say the majority favor a military operation to help them overthrow the regime. The red is that the people who are against the invasion are the guys with guns.
But everybody make comparison between Iraq and Iran. Iraq war, okay? In Iraq, it's not just having gun who make troubles to the American. It's Iran who organized the Shiite militant groups in Iraq, gives them plan, intelligence, training to target the American. And American were not prepared for that. In Iran, you might have a weapon, but who will fund you and organize you and pay money for your food and family, for injuries, etc.?
But I'm much less optimistic about that. There is no shortage of American enemies around Iran, just for two, Pakistan and Turkey. Qatar is another. If Qatar and Turkey are in Iran trying to sow something, and their US partners were going to also try to defend their own interests, and Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, there's no shortage.
Protests happen in Iran, from Mahsa Amini, the Green Revolution, and the latest protests in January. All has imported men from Hezbollah and Iraqi Hezbollah and
Hashtag Shabi.
yeah, to crush the protester, not the other way around. Yes, there are no shortage of anti-American, but you are presuming that the American will occupy as Iraq and become vulnerable.
So I was a planner for the war plan with Iran at CENTCOM. It was a major part of my existence, the biggest part of my existence for about 2 years, and it was a part of what I did the entire time I was there. There was no plan for mass invasion of Iran. It simply doesn't exist unless it's been created since, which I doubt. Our entire perspective was in keeping with the idea, yes, we might be looked at as liberators if we could somehow cause the regime to fall, but nobody wants us there. We totally understood and accepted that. I can't believe that has changed.
I don't think that there's going to be an invasion. Maybe some special forces. But the issue now becomes, who's going to govern Iran after? Because you have security forces, like in Russia, who don't want to allow a pro-US, pro-Israel regime in Iran to succeed. And it's going to take at least 10 years to promote the right officers, purge the wrong ones, and reduce the size of the security forces so they're not a threat to Iranian freedoms. That requires economic growth on a scale that is so huge that you can get rid of 150,000, 200,000 IRGC members to go and work in the private sector, assuming that the private sector would even have a former IRGC guy, colonel, working for you suddenly. This is going to be a long process. Who is going to be able to keep the country together? You cannot promote someone from the security forces to do that because the Iranian people would not accept it. What's going to happen if you promote someone from the regime and then 2 million people are on the street setting mosques and government buildings on fire saying, we don't want you? Are they going to, again, kill the people and we're back to square one? Are you going to parachute Pahlavi into Iran? Then the security forces would conspire against it. And what happens if half the security forces agree to pledge their support to Pahlavi or whoever is running Iran as a pro-US country, and the other half conspire against the first half? You have a civil war.
If our plan is really to send the Kurds in as mercenaries again, I think that's going to get Turkey involved and not in a good way.
My fear is that we're going to just have a Syria policy of may the best man win, good luck. Set aside the humanitarian concerns. Iran is 4 times the Syria at the time of the civil war, almost 4 times. 90 million people, refugee crisis, and foreign countries coming at odds with each other at the center of the world. Iran is literally in the middle of Eurasia. And you're going to have all kinds of power, at least one of them, in the ally of the United States. And who knows, let's say you have a somewhat stable, fragmented Iran. Let's say a Syria of 4 years ago, 3 years ago. There is an equilibrium. Suddenly you could see remnants of the regime in the south saying, hey, China, come have this naval port you wanted, and in exchange, protect us. Rebuilt Russian military could deploy to certain parts of Iran to have a base there. Turkey could be there. Israel, obviously, is going to try to protect its own interests. Azerbaijan, Arab states who are not very kind to each other right now. How is this mess not going to trigger a world war? Someone explain to me.
We know the regime is not going to change just with bombs dropping. So what's the end game?
As of 48 hours ago, I was talking to people and saying, how's it going? Are you worried? And nobody has even left Iran, unlike the 12-day war. They were saying, we're not the target. They have such precise bombs that we're not being hit. We are on the rooftop, I kid you not, they're eating popcorn, watching explosions. And it's theatrical for them. My own theory is that this had been a dead society. There was no dynamism in the society. Life became boring. I don't mean boring in a sense that people say, oh, modern life in liberal free world is boring. Boring as you had a sense that you had become dead inside. Nobody's getting married. Nobody's having children. Nothing's changing. You're living with this hopelessness of a static life under this tyranny. Suddenly, something exciting is happening. So there is a cinematic element to how people are reacting to the war. Oh, something fun.
There was a video yesterday, the guy driving and a woman next to him. They were both singing while seeing these apocalyptic images, the fires triggered by the Israeli strikes. But I want to ask Shay about claim by some Iranian opposition, pro-Reza Pahlavi, that they have people underground similar to the French who are perhaps working with the Israeli intelligence, guiding the strikes, passing important intelligence. And these people might surface later to try to stabilize the country after the collapse of the regime. I agree with that.
Pahlavi announced a mechanism for defection from the regime in June. He now claims that he has 100,000 applications. They say we have to verify these. A lot of them are regime people trying to clog the system or penetrate it. So is even 1% of that true? They would not reveal how many they have verified to be true defectors. If you have, let's say, 15 base commanders, that's a lot to work with. The rank and file of the IRGC are not with the regime necessarily. The lower you go in the ranks, the more anti-regime you get. They do have cells among the people. They do. The January protests do not happen without Pahlavi cells on the ground. It's not just that Pahlavi is so popular that people all began chanting his name. So he has an organization. To what extent that organization is capable of overthrowing the regime, I don't think anybody can tell. But it is there. Again, the issue goes back to, let's say that the Pahlavi defectors exist, and let's say that there's enough of them to overthrow the regime. Is it enough to keep the succeeding regime?
The MEK also claims to have structure inside the country.
MEK has no popular support.
I know, they have popular support, but we've got Pompeo coming out and saying, look, we've got a government in waiting. He's paid.
Yeah, he's paid well. I genuinely think that MEK has more supporters among Western politicians than inside Iran, just by numbers. I'm not at all worried about them, but Pahlavi actually has, again, the question becomes, how do you keep the country together after this? Does he have enough support? Does he have enough connections? I wrote a piece published yesterday that Iran needs a strong man, not a democracy after the regime falls, because Iran has no civil society. There are people who say, oh, Iran has a strong civil society. Civil society requires institutions. Iran has regime institutions that people hate and nothing. It has an educated population, which is not a good thing to keep a country intact. And educated people have opinions, and people with opinions do not take orders. There is no institutions with hierarchy to enforce order.
Right.
The bedrock of a civil society is religion. Iranians hate the mosque. The structure of the economy, which is big business, all connected with the regime, mostly making losses thanks to government subsidies and grants, and small business, small shopkeepers. So the next regime, big business, you don't even know how to keep it together. There's no big capital to maintain order on labor. I know that I keep talking as if we should just not do anything, because if the regime goes, the country will explode. I have spent my entire adult life arguing for regime change. I'm not going wobbly on you, just saying that most of the outcome could go wrong.
So what needs to be done?
The only possible option is send Pahlavi in, tell him, you know what? If you want to execute a few thousand people, we're not going to stand on your way. And the only way you can keep this country together. And the problem is that Pahlavi says that he doesn't have a single autocratic bone in his body. And unfortunately, I think he's right.
Yes.
The only way is to parachute Pahlavi into Iran and say, you have your defectors, work with them, purge, kill, execute whomever might be a problem to you, and just govern with an iron fist for 10 years.
Shay, clearly Pahlavi's not the guy, right? Do you think that
there are people around him who
well,
can be useful?
He's still got this organization, and it's probably the only alternative organization. So unless you get some junior Napoleon inside the IRGC to come and do a deal with America and take over that way, which might be an option, it seems Pahlavi